Scrum planning and estimation. Continuing our discussion around software development lifecycle, now is a good time to remind ourselves of the statement that led to the iterative software approach we are seeing become popular today. The Agile Manifesto. In this talk, we're going to share some ideas about how the last items on the list come to be. That is, responding to change over following a plan. It's important to recognize this doesn't mean that planning is not existent when we do an Agile SDLC, but rather that plans should be flexible and adjustable at the point where they can make the most difference. It became clear quickly that teams that commence without the necessary work of defining the overarching goals of the organization or product owners, these iterations just become rambling, useless efforts with very little chance of success. With Agile planning, the planning is speculative in that we can make a reasonable forecast based on current information. Every project begins with an optimistic view of the outcome. Project managers tend to pad schedules to ensure they can keep their commitments. The engineers or the developers, the people that are on the team delivering the product, who are very close early on, but still optimistic. And executives have learned really not to trust the overestimation of project managers and tend to be focused on the value of the outcome. And so their desire for the estimations to be shorter than given early on, they tend to underestimate the amount of work that needs to be done. Of course, we also see that as the product gets further and the release gets closer to reality, the estimations get a lot tighter. Because just like a weather forecast, if we're trying to decide if it's going to rain 10 days from now, we have a much better idea if it's going to rain in the next hour, because we can see patterns and take in data that's much less likely to change. Normally in Agile projects, we are developing based on time boxes. That is, that we are fixing the time and the resources available to determine the features that can be delivered. These are called sprints or iterations. And our plan is meant to be flexible. And planning is ongoing. So what we'll see is that we tend to make plans for very short iterations, which can be forecast or estimated accurately, and do it often. And we ensure to try to not pack a whole lot into our plan. Really kind of build the skeleton, especially for the components that are very fuzzy, and allow ourselves space for accommodation. This isn't the same as padding our schedule. This is really just only providing details when we have the opportunity to do so accurately. Knowing that estimations are better when they're closer to completion is one of the primary reasons for reducing the planning scope. By time boxing our initiatives, we get the opportunity to estimate smaller projects, shorter timelines, and increase the confidence of our ability to commit to the timelines and the outcomes. The Agile planning onion is a common way to view the different levels of planning in an Agile project, with each layer providing a deeper level of detail with regard to the scope. Our goal at these different levels is to remediate volatility with our vision, meet uncertainty with understanding, counter complexity with clarity, and fight ambiguity with agility. We leave ourselves some room in all of these spaces, but unlike a waterfall approach, where that room turns into estimates very far out into the future that we have no control over, we can make estimates and commitments much closer to the actual delivery. We've already talked about the vision in prior lectures, and just to reiterate briefly, this defines the to-be state, where we want to be. It gives us an opportunity to get our entire team on the same page with the product owner around what it is that we're going to deliver. What is the kind of, what is the product? The roadmap gives us an opportunity to develop milestones along the way to realizing the vision. So when I plan projects, once the vision is set, I like to bucket functionality into a roadmap which defines kind of categories of now, next, and later. Now meaning the most immediate items or functionality that need to be complete. It can be urgent or in the near-term timeline. Next are the items and functionality which are important, but not necessarily the most urgent. We're unlikely to be considering them in our next release planning session. Maybe they'll be brought up in the first release. We may think of the now items as we have to have this to take the product to market. The next items as being, this is what's really going to differentiate our product from competitors. There's all different ways to kind of think about it, but just these three and then the later items are essentially a parking lot that feel more like a nice to have at some point in the future. They're not going to be within our current scope or our current vision. And we'll circle back to the roadmap after a few releases and reevaluate the priorities within regard to the vision. So if we go through a release and we put out our product, we may come back, circle back around and discover that some of those items that are on our next or later list now become now items. And we may discover that there's new items that we need to go add to our next and later list. Releases provide a tangible waypoint along the path of seeing the roadmap come to life. We'll spend some deeper time talking about it on the next slides, what goes into release planning. The important aspect here is that at each release, we're shipping a working product at the end of each release. Iterations, usually aligned with time-boxed efforts called sprints. Some tools allow iterations or use vocabulary that says, an iteration is not necessarily aligned with a sprint. Sometimes tools will use release as an iteration and then sprints being a sub-iteration kind of thing. For our purposes, we are assuming that an iteration is a sprint. This is the first level of planning where timelines and resources are agreed to. And teams that follow the Scrum model also incorporate a daily planning meeting called a daily stand-up, where the teams meet to report out yesterday's results, today's tasks and plans, and any blockers that may need to be resolved. Of course, it's called a standing meeting because everyone in the meeting is standing up in order to make it uncomfortable enough that it finishes quickly. Since Agile encourages shipping products over all else, the focus is to get quickly to where the part is done. And so this doesn't mean that there's no documentation at these other higher levels or no planning for these kinds of timelines, but that these things are held a lot less firmly than the planning stages that are closer to the center of the onion, where our confidence is much higher in the estimations. Release planning gives the team and the product owner opportunities to define what's contained in a particular shippable product increment. In other words, what features and functions will be shipped. The important aspect here is that a release is a product. It may be an early version of a product, such as an alpha release, which is typically tested internally. Maybe a beta release, which is a product that's tested by those that are not directly involved in the creation of the product, or it may be a full-on customer-facing product outcome. The key to negotiating what a release looks like is to agree upon the conditions of satisfaction with the product owner. This means can mean that the product has say no crashing bugs, or that it incorporates a full set of features, or maybe that it has some specific subset of functionality. From here, the stories are estimated and iterations are also estimated, and the stories that make up those releases are defined. If for some reason the level of functionality, the time or resources don't align with the product owner's desire, then this is where we're negotiating kind of that iron triangle trade-off. We either have to reduce the number of stories to fit into the time frame, and with the number of resources that we have, we're going to have to increase the timeline and the number of resources to increase the stories, etc. The Agile Scrum framework at a glance really in this picture here shows the entire process from the backlog, the product backlog, which includes the user stories, through the different iterations and the different kind of approaches and the outcomes along the way. And so when we look at the Scrum framework overall, we already know that our user stories are captured in that product backlog, which has been created with input from our stakeholders or customers, the users, the team, and the product owner. And really that backlog is managed by the product owner. Once the releases are determined, then the work of really kind of planning and estimation begins. And I use these words loosely because it's always estimation. We're getting close. We're not necessarily committing to time frames necessarily. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is different from a traditional approach where the timelines and tasks are all determined before any work begins. So if we were to do a waterfall kind of approach, we would be mapping everything out from the release on down. We would say, these are the different tasks and levels, the different resources that we'll need, and we're trying to plan out very far into the future. In the Agile approach, the planning effort's ongoing. It's revisited every few weeks as the iteration happens. This gives the team an opportunity to refine the estimations. It gives us an opportunity to improve our ability to estimate, adjust for priorities, and then focus on the tasks which get the products delivered. The goal of a good sprint plan is to have the team give a good commitment the about what they'll deliver at the end of the sprint. And so a good commitment means that everyone is clear about what the goals of the sprint are, and that everybody agrees that it's achievable. And what do we mean by achievable? It means that we should be able to meet the commitment, that is the goals of the sprint, the time, the features, the resources, without sacrificing a sustainable pace and without sacrificing the quality. And so we want to make sure we have near release quality releases at the end of every sprint. Sometimes a sprint pre-planning meeting and preparations kind of help, but as much as possible, we want to reduce the number of meetings and any overhead that doesn't deliver a product in this approach. There are a couple of different ways. Well, actually, there's probably one way for every team that goes after looking at sprint planning. But two ways we'll talk about to get to an agreeable state in a sprint plan. We can use the velocity metric, or we can use commitment-based. A velocity-focused sprint planning uses target velocity for the driving metric. User stories in the backlog have a product owner defined, priorities, and the team determines and negotiates a target velocity, usually based on historical metrics. The overall goal for the sprint is assigned, and the user stories that can fit into the negotiated velocity are chosen. Then finally, these stories are split into tasks, and estimates are applied to the tasks. Noticing this is the first time we're actually estimating a completion point. We're putting both a resource and time constraint and kind of really getting down to brass tacks. What can we get done in the next 3-week sprint? It's important that at this point the team will they'll have the best understanding of the user stories that can possibly happen, because at this point we're now developing the user stories and actually defining the tasks along the way, and so it's going to take a strong understanding. A different way to kind of get to the to get to agreement on what's going to happen in a sprint, and usually when we don't have those historical velocity metrics, it's helpful to kind of take this approach where the team commits to a set of work. And it's certainly useful in early sprints when the team's beginning to coalesce and learn how to develop better estimates and break down stories into tasks. Because as we're negotiating kind of story sizes, and we'll see in again in the estimation plan, the teams will start to understand who thinks of what a story size of with 8 points versus 5 versus 3 versus 1, how those kind of line up. And once we've gone through a few iterations together as a team, then start to get a better sense of what does an 8 mean to you versus what does an 8 mean to me. In this kind of commitment-based approach, the priorities are set first and the sprint goals are identified, and then the tasks are developed. And the team so we get an opportunity to do the estimation kind of before we commit. And once we've done this estimation, then we can go back and say, hey, will this meet the commitment plans that we made previously? And if we're able to commit, if we're not able to commit to a particular story, we remove the story and see if we can commit to a subset of those stories. If we feel like we can commit to delivering most of a story and not quite all of it, then we may want to go back and look at either picking up another story and estimating that one, or adjusting the story, creating more than one or two. So really the idea here is that stories are added and removed based on perceived effort rather than leveraging the past estimations. So what goes into planning a story? Really, planning the story is at the point at which the work is determined. The team needs to start with discovering the tasks that are required to for a story to complete. We can also, if you squint, you can almost see an entire mini SDLC, software development lifecycle, in the effort. There's tasks that are going to be required for designing, for coding, for testing, documenting, and also fixing bugs. And all of these things need to be completed before the story is finished. Tasks are assigned to users on the team according to their availability and any other constraints, skill sets, or familiarity or expertise. And there's many ways to track kind of the completion of tasks. And this is where we see Kanban boards often used. And so if you haven't seen a Kanban board, it's simply a palette with columns that represent the work to be done, work that's in progress, and work that's complete. Some of them get a little more advanced, like this example here shows. Our backlog is kind of the work to do. The in progress is things that'll probably be in the current sprint. And then, once they are done being kind of worked on, they move to a peer review stage, a test stage, and then finally to the done stage. Tasks typically on Kanban boards move left to right as they progress through the stages. Different tools, Trello, Jira, Azure DevOps, all of these platforms have something that looks like a Kanban board, and it's managed through issues or stories or tasks. And but the origin of this Kanban board was really just either a whiteboard or a large kind of piece of poster board with post-it notes on it. That's what. So that's kind of the view you see here. It gives a really handy way. This is a really handy way for a team and stakeholders to kind of see progress without having to decipher complex matrices or status reports, Gantt charts, or whatever you happen to be using to kind of manage your project. And at the end of a sprint, the tasks that aren't in the done column, they're just moved back into the backlog to be reconsidered, reinterpreted, or redesigned for a later iteration. As with all project planning, it's important to keep in mind that stuff happens, unexpected stuff happens. When we do waterfall projects, we ask project managers to anticipate these anomalies for an entire project at the outstart. And this is what leads us to having huge buffers and late projects, because either we are overestimating and allowing for catastrophe that's unplanned because of our long time frame, or we are being overly aggressive about what we think we can get done, but we don't really know what work it's going to take to get it done. And in Scrum, we shrink the planning periods to just a couple of weeks. This way, interruptions, diversions can usually be seen a little better, but if they're not, even if they're not, they can be adjusted for very quickly in the next iteration. Um, everyone, it's important to, of course, to ensure that everyone has the right amount of work in each iteration, that no one's taking on too much or is being underutilized. We'll need to account for vacation time, personal leave, and other commitments, but we usually have a much clearer idea of those things when we're looking out just 3 to 6 weeks, as opposed to trying to determine when vacations are going to happen over the next year or 18 months. And so but it's still not completely crisp. So remember to leave a little bit of room for the unknown, and plan as much as possible for the known ideas. And of course, we still have some admin required. We're going to need to ensure the team is communicating effectively, that we have enough time to do some planning, and review what happened in the last sprint to improve. That's really part of the whole cycle, and one of the values of being able to do a project in short sprints is that we can evaluate multiple times throughout the process and reset expectations for the next time. And of course, it's important to understand the interrelationships and dependencies of each of the tasks. Just like in a factory, it's important to identify the constraints and dependencies so we can put our effort on the most kind of important items or constraints, and to keep the rest of the work flowing. So finally, in summary, the Agile onion for planning allows for continual refinement of the vision down to the task level, where we develop a sense of how a product is progressing, and it improves over time as the team learns to evaluate and estimate through experience rather than guesswork. The vision defines the goal, the overarching problems that our product is solving, as well as who it is solving it for. Our roadmap creates that high-level vision of how the objectives defined in our vision are going to be achieved over the long term, and releases set the goals to determine the specific feature that comprise each product version as we release as part of our roadmap. Each iteration helps to define the stories that are part of the next release and that will be delivered in a small batch. And the daily effort gives us an opportunity to have a stand-up and planning effort, so we remove blockers quickly and keep others in the loop of what's going on. When we look at sprint planning, where the goal is to be able to plan the work done during an iteration, the goal being developed and a tested product from each iteration. We introduced the concept of story points to size the work that it might take to develop a story, and we talked about how story points can give us a framework in which to track the team's velocity, or the amount of work that can be completed in a time-boxed iteration. We also talked a little bit about capacity of a team, or how much work we can expect a team to complete given the resources they have. We looked at a couple of different ways to do planning through velocity and commitment-based approaches. One thing that we didn't discuss, but which follows in a follow-on lecture, is when story points are used, how they create a metric that can provide other insights, like how much work is left to do in the backlog, the team capacity based on its current team members, and how to prioritize iterations. We'll look at these next when we talk about estimating user stories and some techniques and approaches to doing that.